This is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network and host of the African History Network show. I was on Roland Martin Unfiltered as a panelist on Friday, September 22nd, 2023. And we discussed the possible upcoming government shutdown, the culpability of the feckless Republicans and Kevin McCarthy. Okay, so I hope you like that discussion. I wanted to talk about a few aspects of this because we had limited time on Roland Martin Unfiltered. I've dealt with this before, back when you had the government shutdown that took place in December 2018 going into January 2019. And we know in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, we know there were 3 government shutdowns in the first 2 years. So let's look at a few articles here dealing with this topic, okay? And I want to also focus in on how this will negatively impact the African-American community. Let's look first at this piece from PBS.org, Public Broadcasting System, PBS.org. And this one is called "The Government is Headed for a Shutdown." Okay. And this is, they picked this up from the Associated Press. The government is headed for a shutdown. Who's affected and what happens next? This is from September 23rd, Saturday, September 23rd, 2023. Okay. And PBS.org picked this up. Now, the federal government is heading toward a shutdown that will disrupt many services, squeeze workers, and royal politics as Republicans in the House, fueled by hard right demands for deep cuts in spending, force a confrontation over federal spending. You have people like Matt Gaetz, as you saw in the segment from Roland Martin Unfiltered. You have the crazy MAGA Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene and some others from the Freedom Caucus, which used to be the Tea Party. Okay, now, so we know spending runs out September 30th. The new fiscal year for the federal government starts October 1st. Okay, here's a look at what happens if the government shuts down on October 1st. First of all, what is a government shutdown? Okay, now, a government shutdown happens when Congress fails to pass some type of funding legislation that is signed into law by the President of the United States. Lawmakers are supposed to pass 12 different spending bills to fund agencies across the government. But the process is time consuming. They often resort to passing a temporary extension called a continuing resolution, or CR, which is a term that you're hearing a lot right now, a continuing resolution to allow the government to keep operating. When no funding legislation is enacted, federal agencies have to stop all non-essential work. Federal agencies have to stop all non-essential work and will not send paychecks as long as the shutdown lasts. So you have furloughs and you have layoffs. Okay, so furloughs basically happen when employees are sent home and they're not going to be paid. Okay, a layoff happens when there's no work for people to do and they're sent home usually and not paid, when you have layoffs. Okay, so you're going to hear possibly about federal employees being furloughed. You're going to have other federal employees who have to show up to work, but they will not get paid until the shutdown is over, and they will receive back pay. Now, although employees deemed essential, such as air traffic controllers and law enforcement officers, still have to report to work, other federal employees are furloughed. Under a 2019 law, those same workers are slated to receive back pay once the funding impasse is resolved. Okay, and this was something that was put in place after that 35-day government shutdown ended in January. It was about January of 2019. All right. Now, some people may ask the question, and I've heard people, I've talked to people personally who ask this question. They say, well, the president and the White House submit the budget to they come up with the White House budget. They come up with the budget to fund the government. Why does Congress get to determine whether the budget gets put into place or not? Why are Republicans able to block what President Joe Biden has said is going to be the budget? Okay, that's a very good question. The reason why is because this goes to the U.S. Constitution, which is why you hear me constantly tell people to read the U.S. Constitution. Okay, now this comes from history.house.gov, history.house.gov, which is the history section of the U.S. House of Representatives. This deals with what's known as power of the purse, power of the purse. Okay. The ability to tax and spend belongs to Congress, not the president. That comes from Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the U.S. Constitution. Quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the recipients of the receipts and expenditures of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So this deals with power of the purse. The ability to tax and spend belongs to Congress, not the president, not the executive branch of the federal government, but the legislative branch of the federal government. Congress, and in particular, the House of Representatives, is invested with the power, quote unquote, the power of the purse. The ability to tax and spend public money for the national government. Massachusetts Elbridge Gary said at the Federal Constitutional Convention that the House of Representatives, quote, was more immediately the representatives of the people, and it was a maxim that the people ought to hold the purse strings, end quote. Okay, so read this. It deals with some history as well behind power of the purse. This goes directly to the U.S. Constitution. This is why I warned people during the 2022 midterm elections how dangerous it would be for Republicans to take back control of the House of Representatives. You're dealing with crazy people. You're dealing with some crazy MAGA Republicans, and they want to shut down some of them want to shut down the federal government. So I posted this on our Facebook page, Michael Imhotep, and our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Okay, Donald Trump wants a government shutdown that will hurt millions of Americans Donald Trump wants a government shutdown that will hurt millions of Americans because he wants to stop his federal prosecution. He is too stupid to realize that that is not how the government works, and his prosecutions will continue. All right. And Jen Psaki talked about this on her show on MSNBC on Sunday, September 24th, 2023. Also, the article from PBS.org, The Government is Headed for a Shutdown, Who's Affected and What's Next, deals with this as well. OK, so here's what Donald Trump posted on Truth Social. All right. He said, and then he posted this on September 20th, 2023. He said, a very important deadline is approaching at the end of the month, end of September. Republicans in Congress can and must defund all aspects of crooked Joe Biden's weaponized government that refuses to close the border and treats half the country as enemies of the state. Treats half the country as enemies of the state. This is also the last chance to defund these political prosecutions against me and other patriots. He's talking about the domestic terrorists who attacked the U.S. Capitol January 6, 2021, who he sent there, okay, to interrupt a constitutionally mandated bicameral, that means both chambers of the legislative branch of the federal government, a bicameral ceremony where they certify the electoral college votes. Okay, he sent them there to stop that process so he could stay in power. He could stay president. He said they failed on the debt limit, but they must now. But he said they failed on the debt limit, but they must not fail now. Use the power of the purse and defend the country. Okay, now, I don't think Donald Trump has ever read the U.S. Constitution before. He sure doesn't act like it. Now, he says he wants to suspend the Constitution. He said that before. He wants to suspend the U.S. Constitution. I don't think he's ever read it. Okay. This is why he has to be stopped in 2024. I warned you about him in 2016. I warned you about his authoritarian-like tendencies. He's gotten even worse. Let's go back to the piece from PBS.org Public Broadcasting System. Something else is very important. 12 different spending bills, okay? Now, this is why understanding the U.S. Constitution is so important. And there's a piece from, there's a graphic from the Washington Post that deals with the White House budget and deals with the federal budget, okay? And there are 12, and I'm going to pull this up here. There are 12 different committees in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate that approve different portions of the budget, okay? And this deals, there's a PDF from Washington Post. There's a PDF from the Washington Post that deals with the budget process. Okay, so this one right here. Let me zoom in on this. This is from WashingtonPost.com. A guide to the federal budget process. A guide to the federal budget process. Okay, and then it goes through and lays this out. This is why Schoolhouse Rock is so important. This is why we need, there's a lack of understanding of basic civics in America, regardless of race. This is why we have to have forums where we can teach the Constitution, teach this history, teach a basic understanding of law, especially federal law. The president's budget request is the first step in the complex process of funding the federal government. Now, this is by Karen Urish and Laura Stanton for the Washington Post. So we have this flow chart. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but discretionary spending is subject to annual approval by Congress. Legislators have less control over mandatory spending, which is devoted to entitlement programs. So one on or before the first Monday in February, the president submits to Congress a detailed budget request for the next fiscal year, which begins October 1st. Okay, the House and the Senate, their conference committees, their appropriations committees, their conference committees will vote on the budget in different parts of the budget. Based on the president's proposal, the House and Senate budget committees propose budget resolutions that sets targets for spending and tax revenue and identify any policies that will need to move through reconciliation. These are sent to the floor for a vote, and differences are resolved in conference. Then we have the approval by 12 subcommittees in the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, okay? The House and Senate Appropriations Committees divided the discretionary spending set forth in the budget resolution among each of their 12 subcommittees. This is why you can't have crazy people like Republicans in charge of the House of Representatives, because they control all of the subcommittees in the House of Representatives. Each subcommittee conducts hearings on the programs under its jurisdiction and votes out of committee the bill. Okay, the full committee marks up the bill, the markup process, and sends the bill to the floor. Both chambers pass their bills and iron out the differences in conference. The House and Senate vote again, and the conference report is sent to the president for his signature or her signature or veto. All of the appropriations bills are supposed to be signed by the president by October 1st, but this rarely happens. To avoid a government shutdown, a series of continuing resolutions, or CRs, as we just talked about, are approved to continue funding the agencies at the current levels. Reconciliation occurs if Congress needs to legislate policy changes in mandatory spending or tax laws to meet the annual targets laid out in the budget resolution. So it goes through the whole process, this whole flow chart. Okay, this is from the Washington Post. Check this out. Share this with your friends and family. A guide to the federal budget process. This is why it's important to have competent people elected to office in the federal government. You can't have MAGA Republicans. You can't have scared Republicans like Kevin McCarthy, okay, in the federal government. And also, even though Senator Joe Manchin, people like to pick on him, even though majority of the time he votes the same way that he votes for policies that Biden pushes, there are other times when Joe Manchin is wrong, like not voting to do a carve out to the filibuster rule for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or even his Freedom to Vote Act, which was a Voting Rights Act bill that he put together because he said he could get 10 Republicans to vote for the bill. He didn't get a single Republican. All 50 Republicans voted against it, as well as Kyrsten Sinema. Okay, she voted not to, even though she did vote for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, she voted against changing the filibuster rule. Okay, now we know that in January of 2017, these two, along with about 28 other Democrats, signed on to a memo saying that they would not change make any changes to the filibuster now that Republicans were in charge of Congress, or in charge of the Senate, I should say. But things have changed. January 6th changed that, and Republicans are abusing the filibuster as well. Okay. All right. Now back to this discussion dealing with understanding a government shutdown. Now, when will the government what is a government shutdown? This is what we were looking at. And we talked about a continuing resolution. All right. Now, when no funding legislation is enacted, federal agencies have to stop all non-essential work and will not send paychecks as long as the shutdown lasts. Although employees deemed essential, such as air traffic controllers and law enforcement officers, still have to report to work, and other employees are furloughed. All right. Now, when would a shutdown begin and how long will it last? Government funding expires October 1st, the start of the federal fiscal year. A shutdown will effectively begin at 12:01 a.m. on October 1st if Congress is not able to pass a funding plan that the president signs into law. It is possible it is impossible to predict how long a shutdown will last. With Congress divided between a Democratic-controlled Senate and Republican-led House, and Speaker Kevin McCarthy's hard-right conservatives looking to use the shutdown as leverage for spending cuts, many are bracing for a stoppage that could last weeks. All right. Now, who does a shutdown affect? Who does a shutdown affect? Okay, millions of federal workers face delayed paychecks when the government shuts down, including many of the roughly 2 million military personnel and more than 2 million civilian workers across the nation. All right. Now, you can read the rest of this here. They talk about TSA, Transportation Security Administration. When you go through TSA security at airports, federal workers are stationed in all 50 states and have direct interaction with taxpayers, from TSA agents who operate security at airports to postal service workers. Now, with some federal offices will also have to close or face shortened hours during the shutdown. With TSA, they would still have to report to work, but their paychecks would be delayed until after the shutdown is over with. You're going to have some government workers like that. Okay, you can have others who will be sent home. Businesses closely connected to the federal government, such as federal contractors or tourist services around national parks, could see disruptions and downturns. The travel sector could lose $140 million daily in a shutdown, according to the U.S. Travel Industry Association. Now, we know that in 2018, 2019, that government shutdown that lasted from December 2018 to January 2019, we know that cost the U.S. government $11 billion. We look at this article here from the New York Times. Let's look at this one here. Government shutdown cost U.S. economy $11 billion, CBO says. That's the Congressional Budget Office, which is a bipartisan organization. This is from January 28th, 2019. Alan Rappaport and Benjamin Applebaum for the New York Times. The 5-week federal government shutdown took a significant economic toll, costing the United States economy $11 billion, with nearly a quarter of that total permanently lost. The Congressional Budget Office said. There was $3 billion lost in December of that year, and there was another $8 billion lost in January. Okay. All right. So read the rest of this piece here. This talks about what happened in 2019, December 2018, January 2019, from the New York Times. All right. Now, if we continue here, let's go back to the piece from PBS.org, Public Broadcasting System, originally from the Associated Press. What about court cases, the work of Congress, and presidential pay? Okay. What about court cases, the work of Congress, and presidential pay? The president and members of the Congress will continue to work and get paid. However, any members of their staff who are not deemed essential will be furloughed. Okay. So they'll be sent home in so they'll be sent home. Now, the judiciary will be able to continue to operate for a limited time using funds derived from court filings and other fees, as well as other approved funding, Notably, funding for the 3 special counsels appointed by Attorney General Merrick Garland would not be affected by a government shutdown because they are paid through a permanent, indefinite appropriation, an area that's been exempted from shutdowns in the past. Okay. That means the 2 federal cases against Benedict Donald, the traitor-in-chief, the former president, as well as the case against Hunter Biden, the son of President Joe Biden, would not be interrupted. So Benedict Donald Trump, the traitor-in-chief, wants his MAGA Republicans to shut down the federal government because he mistakenly thinks that is going to stop his criminal prosecutions by the federal government. And the MAGA Republicans who are pushing this nonsense don't understand how the federal government works, which is why they need to be one of the many reasons why they need to be voted out of office. And 2, Donald Trump does not understand how the federal government works, which is why he should never be in federal office again, whether nominated or appointed. The only thing he should have to do with the federal government, as far as I'm concerned, is being prosecuted by the federal government. All right, now let's go back to this piece here dealing with what happens during a government shutdown. Now, has a government shutdown ever happened before? There have been 21 going back to 1977. Okay, now prior to the 1980s, lapses in government funding did not result in government operations significantly shutting down. But then U.S. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, in a series of legal opinions in 1980 and 1981, argued that government agencies cannot legally operate during a funding gap. Federal officials have since operated under an understanding they can make exemptions for functions that are, quote unquote, essential for public safety and constitutional duties. Since 1976, there have been 22 funding gaps. Some sources say 1977, 21 funding gaps. Okay, since 1976, there have been 22 funding gaps, with 10 of them leading to workers being furloughed. But most of the significant shutdowns have taken place since Bill Clinton's presidency, when then Speaker Newt Gingrich and his conservative House majority demanded budget cuts. Okay, this is why. Now, what's interesting is they want budget cuts when they're not in power, Republicans, when they don't have the White House. When they had the White House, because they weren't talking about all these budget cuts during the first 2 years, especially of the Trump administration. And Donald Trump ran up the national debt. He added $8 trillion to the national debt in 8 years. Donald Trump added $8 trillion. I'm sorry, in 4 years. Donald Trump added $8 trillion to the national debt in 4 years. Republicans largely were not talking about all these spending cuts then. But now that they're not in the White House, now they want all these spending cuts. And they consistently vote against policies that are beneficial to African Americans as well, which is why they should never be in power again. Now, the longest government shutdown happened between 2018 and 2019, when then President Benedict Donald and congressional Democrats entered a standoff over his demand for funding for his fake border wall. Now, didn't Donald Trump say that Mexico was going to pay for his fake border wall? But he shut down the government because he couldn't give funding for his border wall that he lied and said Mexico was going to pay for. Now he wants the government shut down to stop federal criminal prosecution against him. And even if it shuts down, the prosecution is still going to continue. Now, that disruption in 2018, 2019 lasted 35 days through the holiday season, but was also only a partial government shutdown because Congress had passed some appropriation bills to fund parts of the government. Now, what does it take to end a shutdown? Well, first of all, you need some competent people negotiating. One, it's the responsibility of Congress to fund the government. They are constitutionally mandated to fund the government. The House and Senate have to agree to fund the government in some way, and the president has to sign legislation into law. Congress also relies on a so-called continuing resolution, or CR, to provide stopgap money to open government offices at current levels as budget talks are underway. Money for pressing national priorities, such as emergency assistance for victims of natural disasters, is often attached to a short-term bill. But hardline Republicans say any temporary bill is a non-starter for them. Any temporary bill is a non-starter for them. They are pushing to keep the government shut down until Congress negotiates all 12 bills that fund the government, which comes from those 12 subcommittees in the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate, which is historically a laborious undertaking that isn't resolved until December at the earliest. Trump, who is Biden's top rival heading into the 2024 election, is urging on Republican hardliners. If they are unsuccessful, the shutdown could last weeks, perhaps even longer. Okay, so read the rest of this here from pbs.org. The government is headed for a shutdown. Who's affected and what happens? Once again, elections have consequences. Okay, as I stated on Roland Martin Unfiltered, the difference between Republicans being in control of the House of Representatives and Democrats being in control of the House of Representatives was about 7,000 votes over a handful of House district races. Lauren Boebert out of Colorado, she won her race by only 750 votes. Every vote counts. Every vote counts, which is why Republicans work so hard to suppress certain people's votes, especially African Americans. Now, if we look at this, CBSnews.com also has a good article. Why does a government shutdown affect most? Who does a government shutdown affect most? Here's what happens to the agencies Americans rely on. This is from CBSnews.com. Let's pull this up. You can check this one out as well. Who does a government shutdown affect most? Here's what happens to agencies Americans rely on. This is from September 22nd, Friday, September 22nd. And there's just a couple of things. zoom out on this. There's a couple of things I want to highlight on this one here. So a shutdown occurs when Congress fails to approve a new spending for federal agencies, which are generally barred from spending money without congressional authorization. Okay, there are some exceptions, like activities needed to protect life and property. Each agency makes its own determination about which employees are needed to stay on the job, meaning the impact on federal operations can vary widely. All right, now, since no annual spending bills have passed, a government shutdown would touch nearly every corner of the vast federal government. Okay, since no spending bills have passed, a government shutdown would touch nearly every corner of the vast federal government. Vast federal government, excluding programs that have permanent funding. Many federal employees would be required to keep working without pay. Hundreds of thousands more would be furloughed and sent home with their paychecks delayed until there is a resolution. Okay, so some would have to continue working without pay. They'll get back pay once a budget is passed and signed into law. Like TSA agents, they would continue to work without pay. Hundreds of thousands of other federal employees would be sent home, and their paychecks are going to be delayed until there's a budget. The budget passes and is signed into law. Okay, so you can read the rest of this here. It talks about Social Security Administration. Seniors will still get their Social Security checks. Takes you through all this. And they talk about, one of the things they talk about here is food assistance. Okay, the SNAP program. That's on page 3. Let's see if we can see this here. Social Security, Postal Service food assistance. While funding for the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is mandatory, the actual issuance of benefits can be affected by a government shutdown, since the Department of Agriculture employees are not receiving a paycheck. Typically, in a shutdown, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the USDA is authorized to send out SNAP benefits for 30 days. After that, benefits can become dicey. Okay, so this deals with SNAP benefits that feed children and families. Then they talk about air travel. Travelers may feel the pain at the nation's airports as a result of a shutdown, as air traffic controllers and TSA agents, Transportation Security Administration agents, would have to work without pay, according to the White House. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said a shutdown could mean significant delays for travelers, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg told Congress on Wednesday that a lapse in funding could come at exactly the wrong moment, and halt training for roughly 2,600 air traffic controllers. There is currently a shortage of roughly 3,000 air traffic controllers in the United States, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg warned a shutdown would come, quote, at the very moment when we finally have those air traffic control workforce numbers headed in the right direction, end quote. Okay, so read the rest of this as well. All right, now there's a couple pieces I want to look at dealing with how this impacted African Americans in 2019. Okay, so, and I talked about this in 2018, 2019, when the government shutdown was taking place. There's one from, let's look at the one from, there's one from pbs.org that I want to look at. And then there's also one from thegrio.com. Okay. So if we look at, NPR, that's the one I want, NPR, National Public Radio. Okay, because this, the person who was interviewed here was mentioned in the article from thegrio.com. Okay, barely treading water while the shutdown disproportionately affects Black Americans. This is from National Public Radio, NPR.org. And let's flip over to this right here. Just a second. Okay. This one right here, barely treading water. Why the shutdown disproportionately affects Black Americans. This is from January 14th, 2019. This is written by Ari Shapiro. Okay, so in this piece, I'm just going to highlight this here. It says, as the government shutdown enters its fourth week, becoming the longest in United States history, federal workers around the country are struggling to make ends meet. But according to Jamal Lartey, Lartey, a reporter with The Guardian, theguardian.com, a UK publication, the shutdown is having a disproportionate effect on Black workers and their families. African Americans make up a higher percentage of federal workers than they do the non-government workforce. It's about 18%, as I said on Roland Martin Unfiltered. That's in part because for generations, government has provided good wages and job security to African Americans who faced overt discrimination in the private sector. Ari Shapiro of NPR's All Things Considered sat down with Lartey to talk about some of the ways this disparity is playing out right now. Okay, so Ari Shapiro asked, could you explain the history that led to our situation today, where African Americans make up a higher percentage of the federal workforce than they do in the private sector? James Lartey said the federal government obviously has its own untoward history of racial discrimination, from underwriting redlining and federal mortgage programming and excluding African Americans from New Deal programs. But it also has been the institutional vanguard of the nation's slow march towards equality, more so than the private sector at large and more than most state and local governments. In 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which banned race discrimination in the defense industry. Okay, now I talked about this on Roland Martin Unfiltered when we discussed, it was a couple of days before the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. And Executive Order 8802 came about because A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters threatened to put 100,000 African Americans on to march on Washington to embarrass President Roosevelt if he did not desegregate jobs in the Department of Defense. So the day before the march was supposed to take place, because this was going to be the original March on Washington, the day before the march was supposed to take place, President Roosevelt conceded and signed Executive Order 8802. All right, now let's continue. In 1941, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, and that's largely seen as the most important move in support of the civil rights of African Americans from Reconstruction, which ended in 1877, Reconstruction, all the way until 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed. The federal government, for fairly obvious reasons, just did a better job of abiding by the Civil Rights Act than the labor market at large. Okay, so then they talk about the racial wealth gap. We know that African-American families have a fraction of the wealth of white families. According to the Census Bureau, for every $100 in white family wealth, Black families have just over $5. Now, this was in 2019. Okay, so what does that mean when African-American government workers start missing a paycheck? Okay, so the profound racial, Jamil Lartey responded, the profound racial wealth gap in the U.S. makes it far more difficult for the average African American to sustain a long period without a paycheck as compared to white Americans. We should note that the disparity in wealth is probably much less acute among federal workers. We don't have numbers of African American federal workers' wealth versus white federal workers' wealth. It's probably much closer than the broader disparity. But overall, African Americans are less likely to have friends, family, networks, access to credit, you name it. Things that will help you survive a period without a paycheck, they're less likely to have it. Okay, so read the rest of this piece here. This deals with how African Americans, generally speaking, are disproportionately negatively impacted by a federal government shutdown. All right. Okay, so read the rest of this here. They also talk about women. Tell me about the gender divide. Women make up 60% of the federal workforce, higher than a percentage they make up of the general population. What's the significance of that gender divide on African American families? African American families are about 10.5% of the civilian labor force, but 18.4% African Americans, I should say, not African American families. African Americans are about 10.5% of the civilian labor force, but 18.4% of federal employees. This is what I was saying. We make up about 18% of federal employees, but with 13.5% of the U.S. population. Now, according to data from the Office of Personnel Management, the share of federal workers who are African American women is roughly twice as high in the federal government as in the greater civilian workforce. This won't be new to anyone who studies race in America or is cognizant of how it works, but it's going to disproportionately affect African American women. Okay, so read the rest of this piece here. Barely treading water, why the shutdown disproportionately affects Black Americans. This is from January 14, 2019, from NPR.org, National Public Radio. Then we look at this piece here also from January 2019. This is from January 16th, 2019 for TheGrio.com, which also cited Shapiro, Ari Shapiro from National Public Radio. The name of this piece here is, and let me try to close out this ad here. Experts state that the shutdown has deeply affected Black families. Experts state that the shutdown has deeply affected Black families. While Americans have felt the financial hit from the shutdown, no community has felt the economic sting more than African Americans. Almost a month in, the damage is not only taking place on the economy, but it is also affecting many African American federal workers and their families. Okay, so read this piece also. They talk about, according to BusinessInsider.com, 800,000 federal employees and millions of government contractors are currently going without pay. This is from January 2019. Okay, and then they cite the article that I talked about, the piece from NPR.org. Ari Shapiro spoke to Guardian reporter Jamil Larty about how the shutdown has disproportionately affected African Americans, who make up more of the federal workforce than any other population. Okay. All right. So I'll read this piece here from TheGrio.com. And they talk about African American businesses also. Jamil Larty also noted that there's no precedent for government contractors to receive back pay when the shutdown ends. Thus, no one fully knows if they will receive income for the weeks that they were furloughed. Okay, now I know that Democrats in Congress are trying to get a bill passed to try to give back pay to federal contractors who were laid off or something of that nature. African American owned businesses make up 11.7% of registered federal contractors. By and large, these minority companies are going to be hit harder than others. So you have all these economic empowerment gurus out here talking about start a business and you can get government contracts and things like this. But some of them mistakenly say stupid ass things like, we don't need to vote, we just need to do economic empowerment. Have you heard them say stupid ass things like that? My degree is in business administration with a major in marketing from Wayne State University. I taught entrepreneurship for 7 years, managed a business consulting company for 7 years, a black-owned business consulting company. I managed African-American-owned companies that had government contracts, city of Detroit, county of Wayne, state of Michigan. Okay, so I'm not talking about what I read in textbooks, even though I read the textbooks. I'm not talking about what I saw in documentaries, even though I'm in 7 documentaries. I'm talking about actually what I've done, actually putting together bids for contracts, actually winning contracts, actually doing it, not reading about it in textbooks. This is devastating for African-American owned firms that have federal government contracts. And yes, we should have federal government contracts because we pay taxes. That's taxpayer dollars. So we're going to pay taxes and all that money is going to go to white-owned companies? That's stupid. TheBusinessInsider.com also notes that the shutdown is not only the financial woe that America has to worry. It's not the only financial woe that America has to worry about. Okay. The U.S. is also dealing with the negative effect of the U.S.-China trade war. Now, this is back during 2019, the U.S.-China trade war as well. Okay. So read the rest of this article. This is from thegrio.com. Experts state that the shutdown has deeply affected Black families. This is from January 16th, 2019. So once again, this all shows us how elections have consequences. All right. And, you know, I teach a whole concept called political self-defense. Everybody visit, you know, if you like this type of information, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. You can register for the online classes that I teach as well at our website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And listen to the African History Network show also. But I teach a whole concept called political self-defense. Okay. And I study politics. That's why I'm not just a historian. Okay. But I also study politics as well. And when we deal with political self-defense, I'm going to show you a couple slides from my presentation here. It's not only about what people can do for you, but it's also understanding how to stop what people are trying to do to you. Okay. It's understanding political self-defense. Okay. So let's pull this up here. All right. So political self-defense deals with understanding how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Okay. Laws create conditions. Conditions create movements. People organize to fight against the conditions. Legislation is put in place. Policies are put in place to address the conditions that the movements were created to address. Now, so when we look at 6 principles of political self-defense, we have to match. We have to elect someone whose policies best match our issues and concerns. This is why a Black agenda is so necessary to give standards and hold people accountable. A Black agenda is not what politicians give us. A Black agenda is what we put together and organize and put together based upon understanding history, economics, law, and politics. And that's what we present to elected officials. I hear people mistakenly say, I'm not voting for anybody who doesn't have a Black agenda. This is what people said. Some people said in 2018 in Florida when Ron DeSantis was running against Andrew Gillum. All right. And I cautioned them and I said, they said that they weren't voting for Andrew Gillum because Andrew Gillum doesn't have a Black agenda. I said, well, Ron DeSantis has a Black agenda. He has an anti-Black agenda. And an anti-black agenda is worse than not having a black agenda. And you see how things are playing out in Florida, from the attacks on African Americans voting, from him putting together a police force to go arrest African Americans who were ex-offenders who received their voter registration card in the mail, and they were told that they could vote, to the attacks on the AP African American Studies course, to the social studies standards coming from the Florida Department of Education that Ron DeSantis also supports. And part of what is being taught to middle schoolers is that some enslaved Africans benefited from skills that they learned. All this nonsense coming out of Florida. Okay, Ron DeSantis has an anti-black agenda. All right, so we have to elect people whose policies best match our issues and concerns. Also, we have to elect somebody who can create an environment for us to push our agenda the farthest and get the most accomplished. Okay. We have to, number 3, stop financing our own dehumanization. Many times we do this and don't know it, like our pension funds. Some of our pension funds are invested in privatized prisons. Okay. In January, I think it was January of 2017, you had employees in the city of New York who divested $48 million from 3 privatized prisons. Okay. Because you can contact your benefits manager and you can find out where your pension fund dollars are invested, or as well as your 401k dollars. The teachers in California, through the California Teachers Union, they did the same thing after they found out that some of their pension fund money was being invested in 3 gun manufacturers, including the gun manufacturer that manufactured the Bushmaster AR-15 assault rifle that was used in the Sandy Hook shooting. All right. So oftentimes we're financing our own dehumanization and don't know this. This article right here, June 8th, 2017, New York pension fund to back out of investments in private prisons. This is my presentation on political self-defense. Okay. Then also, let's see here. We have to, somebody who can be pushed. We have to elect someone who can be pushed in the right direction to do the right thing. They don't have to be perfect. I gave the example of, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Executive Order 8802, because he was pushed by A. Philip Randolph, okay, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, all right? Read about Executive Order 8802 at Britannica.com. This breaks this down in the role that A. Philip Randolph played, okay? Number 5, we have to use leverage. We have to leverage our economics to enforce our political agenda. FEC.gov shows the it shows all the corporations that have donated to a political organization, and it shows the names of people who donated to political organizations at the federal level, House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, things of this nature. Leverage our pension funds, 401k dollars, etc. Read this article here from HuffingtonPost.org, the O'Reilly factor on Fox News. The Black organization helped oust Bill O'Reilly by hitting Fox where it hurts. It was colorchange.org, and about 80 organizations put pressure on advertisers of Bill O'Reilly, and they got advertisers to withdraw money from Bill O'Reilly's show, the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News, so much so that his show wasn't profitable anymore, and Roger Ailes cut ties. Now, he was dealing with sexual harassment lawsuit as well, okay? But it was the right time, but they leveraged their economics to enforce their political agenda. Read this piece from MSNBC.com, April 11, 2014. Lyndon Johnson was a civil rights hero, but also a racist. But the civil rights organizers and Dr. King and the Big Six African-American leaders, etc., they were able to put pressure on Lyndon Johnson to pass a Civil Rights Act in 1964, a Voting Rights Act in 1965. He did not want to pass a Voting Rights Act in 1965, a Fair Housing Act in 1968, etc. Executive Order 11246, September 1965, which was affirmative action. They were able to get a number of things from President Lyndon Johnson because they put pressure on him. Okay. And then lastly, we also have to elect people into office who will protect gains that have been made. To be able to protect gains that have been made, we have to assess gains that were made as well. Okay, so this is understanding political self-defense. Political self-defense. All right, visit our website, TheAHNShow.com. Register for the online classes that I teach. We teach them on Saturdays and Sundays. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. And it is a 12-week online history class that I teach. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. You can register for that now at a discount. That's on sale $60, regularly $130. Even after the course is over with, you can still go back and watch it as much as you want to. It doesn't expire. Then Sundays, usually 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Black resistance movements from the Haitian Revolution, U.S. Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, and Black Power Movement, 1800 to 1968. Okay, you can support us through PayPal, Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show. Okay, and this is all at our website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. If you want me to speak for your group or organization, you can contact me right through the website. Click right here at the top of the page, contact the African History Network. You can email me right there, or email me at AHNShow@TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Remember, right now is correct wrong behaviors, not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time.